When is a child's sadness more than a simple reaction to the ups and downs of everyday life? And how do you know when that sadness is actually depression that needs treated? Our expert guests have some answers to those questions and more next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. Once upon a time, we didn't believe children could become depressed. Sad? Sure. Meltdowns? Most definitely. But not the illness that is clinical depression. Thankfully, science caught on to the fact that our original thoughts about kids in depression were just a fairy tale that wasn't ending happily ever after. So what do you do when your child is sad and you think something isn't right? Well, if you have concerns about a depressed child or just want to know more, you've come to the right place. As always, your calls and questions are welcome as we explore this week's topic. So call the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We're going to be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. Joining me tonight is Dr. Steve Bauer. He's the medical director at the Human Development Center, who's board certified in child, adolescent, and adult psychiatry. And Dr. Dan DeAllard is a licensed clinical psychologist with the Duluth Psychological Clinic, who conducts psychological evaluations and provides therapy to both children and adults. Thanks to both of you for coming here tonight. And Dan, I think I'll start with you. What was up with that whole notion that kids couldn't become depressed, that only adults could have clinical depression?
That's a great question. I think to some degree we got misled by the complexity of depression. We know complexity is a part and parcel of adult depression. We thought because of kids' developmental, the ways they weren't developed as adults were that they couldn't experience the full range of symptoms. We now know much better. It's still tricky to know what is sort of typical developmental progression and what's a symptom of depression, but we know for sure it's there, as your opening suggests.
And I think that maybe a part of this also is that whole notion of, well, childhood is a happy time, the connecting variations in mood to it's just a phase or it's just a bad day, that maybe that kind of played a part. And certainly back then we didn't know as much about mental illness as we do today as well.
That's absolutely right. And part of what we know now is the prolonged sad or down mood that we see often in adult depression is not the typical mood presentation for depression in youth. The mood can be much more variable and still be problematic. And so that's one way our understanding has developed.
So let's talk a little bit about that, Dr. Bauer. How, in fact, does clinical depression present itself in children, and if that's different in, say, young children from teenagers as well?
Yeah, I think Dan's point is right on. We're seeing that kids don't experience the pervasive overall consistent depression that we see in adults. Kids have always had shorter episodes, and their presentation at times appears more perhaps resilient, and yet overall their function is still impaired. And impairment of function is really one of the keys to making a diagnosis of clinical depression, both in children and adults. But the disturbances that we look for in terms of sleep, appetite, energy, those consistent pieces. And you mentioned tantrums in the opening. The irritability factor is probably a bigger piece in kids that are upset, unhappy for long periods of time, and that part is one of the other symptoms that we really latch onto.
You're nodding your head that irritability is much more common in kids than necessarily a sad mood then.
That's right, yeah. And I think that's one of the ways where kids' different emotional lives shows up, that the prolonged sadness can often come from a sense of hopelessness or pessimism that adult cognition, adult sense of the future can lead to, whereas a more variable mood, which results in quicker bursts of irritation or frustration with a local event, I also think it's important to add to what Steve said about the relationship between depressed mood and behavior. We are strongly discouraged as clinicians from diagnosing behavior disorders in the presence of a depressive disorder. And there's good science behind that, because so often depression shows up primarily in a youth's behavior, and we don't want to label that as the primary problem. We want to get at the underlying piece, which is often the mood and other depressive symptoms.
Poor self-esteem and hopelessness still a part of what we would see in childhood depression?
Certainly, and those two are things that quite often our own interpretation or values of those are more difficult for kids to agree to. And yet, you know, the state of having good self-esteem can quite often vary extremely, and the longer you go with that idea, the harder it is for you to report yourself as being of regular mood.
And I think the other variable that would come into play would be the notion of how do you even talk to a kid about self-esteem? Like, how do you have that language, right, where you're getting at that concept of how do you feel about yourself? And maybe one way we know is if we see obviously an abrupt change. That's a good way of knowing. But what are some other questions that, say, you might ask or that parents could ask about to determine where kids were in their own sense of their self?
Yeah. If I were just to meet you, Billy, how would you describe yourself to me? Pretend I didn't know you. What words would you use? Sometimes I'll offer kids a list of adjectives about oneself and have them choose, and that list will have a whole range of positive and negative and neutral terms. And if they shade towards the negative ones, I'm concerned. It's also crucial to get information from caregivers, to ask parents, what is the child saying at home? If you can hear from teachers, what are they saying about themselves at school? It doesn't always show up in the office, but it certainly shows up in day-to-day behavior, and observant adults will see it.
Let's talk about that impairment in functioning. That's so important in terms of diagnosing whether you actually have a psychological problem. And that's the difference, that's the key difference between normal sadness that we might see in a kid and clinical depression, then. That's what you're saying.
Correct. That, you know, the length of impairment, and then having some impairment probably at school, but also in relationships, also with your family, taking care of chores. And just as you said, the abrupt change is really one of the things that we look for when we're taking that history of depression versus a longer term issue with behavior or other things that way.
Are we seeing the social withdrawal in kids in the same way that we see with adults in childhood depression?
I don't think exactly the same. It's similar, but think about what counts as a status insult as an adult. Not getting a job, not getting a promotion, say. Well, the equivalent of that in childhood is they're not allowed me sit with them at lunch. Mm-hmm. Or I didn't get invited to a birthday party. So you have to recognize what's developmentally appropriate that might be wounding interpersonally, and recognize that that's a withdrawal too. Or choosing not to go to the birthday party you're invited to. Boy, that's unusual. That's probably a change from baseline and certainly atypical for kids. So similar sort of status insults cause withdrawal, but they look different developmentally.
Not having an interest in cherished activities is a symptom in adult depression. Yep. Do we see that with kids too, where, loved hockey last season, doesn't love it now, and how can we tell when somebody's all of a sudden not love for hockey is indicative of a psychological problem versus like, I'm just not good at hockey and I don't like hockey anymore?
Or the coach has been picking on me and I don't want to play anymore, which, the grouping of symptoms is really what we're looking for that syndrome that we refer to as clinical depression. And so each one isolated by itself is harder, and I always talk about what I call neurovegetative, or the physical symptoms of depression, that are the sleep and the appetite and those kinds of things, because situations with a love of certain activities, and when we switch friends, or somebody breaks up with their girlfriend, or those kinds of things, those become, for a while we used to talk about exogenous and endogenous, or internal and external reasons for depression, which didn't hold up very well, so we try not to emphasize those as much. But someone who, you know, out of nowhere starts not sleeping, their appetite goes down, they lose weight, and they say, well, I don't really want to play hockey anymore, and that was their passion. That's more indicative, as opposed to, I'm worried I'm going to get cut, and I'm going to go switch and play basketball now, or those kinds of things.
So parents, the take-home tip of what he just said is that it has to be a group of symptoms. That's one thing. And biological symptoms are really key to differentiating between the illness that's depression and just kind of having a sad time of it. Dan, let's talk about what are some of the triggers or precipitating events that can cause, or the causal agents related to childhood depression?
Yeah. So many, and again, many of them are paralleled in adult life, but things like a loss of a relationship, a loss of status. I didn't make the team. I didn't make the AP honors class. I used to have this group of friends, and now I have a different group of friends. I'm not as well accepted. Family strife, parent conflict, divorce, certainly abuse or neglect. There's all sorts of things that can come on suddenly or be chronic that can prompt someone into a depression. We also shouldn't ignore the fact that we all have varying susceptibilities to develop depression. So genetically we get set up to easily get tripped into depression or not, or anywhere on the spectrum. So, but those are some of the events that can activate a susceptibility.
And expand upon a little bit about what Dan said about the role that a parent's depression or a parent's mental illness, may not be depression, could be some other mental illness, could play in the development of childhood depression.
Yep, so we're pretty convinced that there are certain genetic markers that may eventually be found to be helpful in us deciding who's more vulnerable and who isn't. But clearly, when a family has had multiple first-degree relatives that are struggling with mood disorders of whatever kind, or more serious kind of schizophrenia or those kinds of things, we know there's both an impact in growing up in that family as well as having the same genetic vulnerability. So both of those play a factor. Right now there isn't a real clear understanding of which specific gene, and it's probably several, if not many, and those things in each person will determine somewhat your vulnerability, and then how much stress and other factors weaken the person to the point that then this gets expressed once or more than once.
And so this is really many physical illnesses. It's the same story. It's not just one gene, it's multiple genes, but it's not just genes, it's your environment and the stressors and how you're living your life. And it's kind of the same thing. And what we know for mental illness is really no different with respect to at least many mental illnesses then. Yes. Let's move a little bit now towards the treatment. How are we treating kids with depression?
Lots of research and lots of experience tell us that generally a combination of therapy and medicines is the best approach for most people. Now it's very specific, individual and specific, so we have to get to know a person and see how they respond to treatment. But typically there are what we call psychosocial approaches to treating depression in therapy that focuses on how one thinks, one's relationships, etc. And there are often medicines that are quite helpful as well. So both of those are the pillars of treatment for most people.
And Dan mentioned medicine. You're a doctor. That's kind of tricky because some kids who develop depression are pretty young. And maybe we should backtrack and say, like, how young can you be and develop clinical depression?
Well, that's a great question, because during World War II, there was a gentleman named Spitz who did some trials with newborn babies, and it was in the nurseries where they were deprived of their parents. And he proved that when parents aren't around, babies had the symptoms of depression. And so this can occur very early depending on the stress and vulnerability piece. So fluoxetine, when it first came out, did studies in 2-year-olds.
Also known as Prozac more generally to the
Correct.
general public. Yep.
Yes.
In
So-
2-year-olds.
2-year-olds, which even for those of us going into child psychiatry, this was a bit of a stretch, and yet, you know, it's relatively safe and has been a medicine that's been fairly effective, though studies of medicine generally fall short of proving definitively that there is a great response, and some of that, I think, has to do with the group that they select to study. And so when we set up studies, we tend to take people who only have depression, which means you take away kids who have been abused, you take away kids who have conduct issues, you take away kids with learning disabilities, you take away kids with physical illness. And that's a pretty resilient group that doesn't have those other stressors. But if you have those other stressors, it's very clear that these medicines wind up being helpful, and how helpful is somewhat determined, I think, with a combination of genetics and response. And clearly the therapy has always been the least controversial, most helpful piece, and I think folks who have had the opportunity to see both work together really feel, just as Dan has described, that that combination is most helpful.
Are we more inclined, are you more inclined, because I'm not doing it, I ain't prescribing anything, but are you more inclined to be prescribing medication to a preteen or a teenager with depression, or does that just depend on the person sitting in front of you?
You know, it's individually based. There are lots of factors that kind of go into coming up with a good plan. And teenagers are more adult-like physiologically. We actually consider 16-year-olds to be adult-like physiologically, even though legally we still wait until they're 18, and different doctors will treat people up till 18 or not. So there's those kind of different definitions. And the preteen has a little more developmental structure and some things that when they hit adolescence, there's a little more expected chaos and up and downs, if you will. One of the hardest questions that was asked to me in training was define normal adolescence. As a first-year trainee, I stumbled a bit and wandered around until I realized, well, that's going to be the real hard question all through this, isn't it? And that part, for each teen, the meaning of medicine is to some degree as important as which medicine we pick. There was an analyst out east who did a study of adults, but talked about if they wanted to be on medicine or they wanted therapy in their study, they actually responded more than if you picked them and said, you get medicine when you wanted therapy. They didn't respond very well. And I think that's true for all of us.
And here's a question, Dan. A man from Duluth wants to know, is DBT an effective therapy for children who are depressed?
I think it can be. I think of...
And so let's maybe back up, because I probably even shouldn't have asked the question that way. Like, let's explain first, what do we mean by DBT, and what is DBT therapy?
DBT stands for dialectical behavior therapy, and it's a sort of treatment that was developed for personality disorders, pretty far removed from depression, a couple of decades ago. It focuses on developing skills, emotion regulation skills, interpersonal skills, etc. And
distress tolerance.
Distress tolerance, coping with one's own dysphoric emotions, etc. And it worked wonderfully for the personality disorders that it was developed for, but we also found that those are skills that depression can impact. So oftentimes folks who struggle with depression and other things such as anxiety, etc., folks benefit from learning those skills. So yes, it's not typically a first-line treatment, but it's often a nice adjunctive treatment for youth who have found their social abilities or distress tolerance abilities compromised by depression, or as Steve alluded to, have other conditions that they're struggling with in addition to depression.
Now, we know that suicidal thinking can be a part of depression in adults, and so what do we know about this in kids, and at what age can kids start even having either thoughts about death or about wanting to die or I wish I wasn't here, or actually active thoughts about suicide?
Yeah, great question. It really depends on what they're exposed to and where they start thinking about it. I've seen very young children who, out of the blue apparently, started talking about this, and it's a clear sign that, as they told me in training, whether you have any other symptoms or not, if you're suicidal, you're depressed. So that part of, okay, there's a pretty clear, I need some help kind of comment. So understanding it, how well they understand it, when other members of the family or extended family or community wind up having some of this, you'll see it kind of reverberate out through the population and comes back in kind of different ways.
And so you said very young, and by very young you mean, because parents want to know this, so.
I've had 5 and 6 year olds who are talking about it, and I'm sure there's folks who would say they've met younger children who've talked about it as well. So, kind of the onset of verbal skills at times depends on where and when you're learning those things.
So I just heard the Duluth parents and the Northland parents watching this suck in air as Dr. Bauer said this. So if you're a parent then and you just heard this, how should you be monitoring this in your child?
Mm-hmm. I think any sort of statement your child makes that makes you worried about their safety, whether it's by their own hand or someone else's hand, you ought to take very seriously and have professionally assessed. When it comes to, I don't want to be here, I don't want to live anymore, I want to be dead, things like that, I think an immediate assessment at minimum with a primary physician or with a mental health professional makes a lot of sense. As Steve said, that single statement is enough to trigger an assessment for depression and risk.
And if your child seems depressed in the way that we've been talking about that, we encourage people to ask other adults, like, do you feel like hurting yourself? Do you feel like killing yourself? Mm-hmm. Are you suggesting that parents should do the same thing with a child or a teenager?
Absolutely. Just like you might inquire about anything else alarming or concerning your child said, don't avoid discussing it. If it becomes taboo, children learn it's not safe to discuss this. Thank goodness they said it out loud, is the approach we ought to have. Let's take that as an opening to explore it further.
What do you say to parents who are really nervous about their child going on medication, especially younger kids, and who have concerns about, oh, what's this going to do to them in the long run? Is this going to change them? Is this going to affect their development or their personality?
Yeah, I think it's a very understandable concern, first and foremost, and yet I think, back to some of the shows you've done before where you had the doc who was specializing with mothers who are going to give birth and talked about the risk to the baby that is not getting enough nutrition and those kinds of things. I think you have to put it in context of how much has this already impacted their physical well-being and development at that point.
How much has the illness of depression affected?
Exactly. So, if their appetite is off and they're losing weight and they're not sleeping, how does that affect them? That's certainly a stressor. There's been some research, and it's not very definitive, but that if people get a bad illness first, it may set them up to have more bad illnesses down the road. And so you have to kind of weigh the risks and benefits with each situation. And in terms of which piece of that becomes most important, I think, when we've gone, the definition is more than 2 weeks, but certainly by the time you've had a month or two of continuous physical symptoms that are leading to loss of function and those kinds of things, medicines can make some of those physical symptoms start to turn around, and it will usually produce a reasonable response. And I think in those cases, we see that as a part of treatment, certainly not the only treatment, but part of treatment.
Well, we are out of time, gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming here tonight. I think, what is the take-home message? The take-home message, number one, is children can have clinical depression. And if children are out there having clinical depression, that means they're suffering. We don't want kids to be suffering, and they don't need to suffer needlessly, because we have very good treatments for depression, including treatments that are very helpful for children who have depression. So if you have concerns, please seek out help for your child or a family member's child or a friend's child. Just get help, because it's the right thing to do. Thanks so much for joining us with this discussion. And don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links, and read my blog, which I know I'm behind on. That's the place where I answer more of your questions. And join us again next week, when we'll be talking about rebuilding your world after it's fallen apart. And on that note, I want to send out our condolences. Our prayers and thoughts are with all of the community and family members in Oregon who have just suffered greatly from the latest shooting tragedy out there. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.